All over mainstream media, you've likely seen the news that video games are blowing up. Esports is the next big thing. The markets are doing so well. $billion industries, etc., etc. However, if you are a gaming fan, you've likely noticed that some of your favorite gaming media publications are shutting down during the crazy pandemic over the last few years. A lot of them have had to close their doors, or you're seeing a mass exodus of staff. So what exactly is going on? In this episode of Tech Girl Talks, we're going to unpack exactly what the issue is in gaming media right now and talk about the death of the video games journalist. This, of course, was recorded live on Twitch at 1 p.m. SAST every Wednesday. You're getting a chance to see the VOD, but if you have any questions or any thoughts, feel free to drop them in the comments below, or alternatively, hit that sub button so you never miss an episode. Helps if you hit the bell as well. And if you enjoy the show, make sure you give it a like as well. It is Tech Girl Talks, and today we're talking about the death of the gaming journalist. And of course, before we get into this, it's my usual disclaimer, but I'm going to drop it one more time because this one is really important. Before we get into it, before we start talking, this is my opinion. And of course, my opinion is not the right way. My opinion is framed by my own experiences, and your opinion is framed by yours. And of course, if we share those opinions, we can possibly learn something. So please take note that some of the things I might say, maybe you disagree with because of your own experiences, and that's completely okay. And I'd encourage you to share those experiences because this is a great way for us to start a dialogue. I feel like this might be unnecessary, but I'm going to do it anyway because maybe you're going, well, how are you qualified to talk about the death of the gaming journalist? You shoutcast, you talk loudly over people playing video games, and sometimes you create content on the internet and you take selfies. Who are you and why are you allowed to say this? I want to give you a little bit of background about me. So I have a BA degree in journalism. It's what I studied. I also have an honors degree in communication science. Funny story, I was invited to do my master's focusing specific on media ethics in the digital world. I chose not to because I thought it sounded like a lot of work. While I was studying to be a journalist, I worked at a PR company, a public relations company in the music industry. So I learned a lot about how PR companies operate. While I was studying as well, I also took a job at a small community newspaper in my neighborhood. It specifically was a sports newspaper. And the role that I had there was not as a writer or a journalist. My role was in advertising sales. So my job was to go out and convince small companies in the area to advertise in the newspaper. So I've sold advertising from a media point of view. When I graduated, I went on to work at a very prominent youth radio station in my province, and probably one of the more prominent youth stations in the country that I'm in, South Africa. It's called YFM, and I worked there in the newsroom, first as a sub-editor, moved into doing some journalistic work, specifically focusing on court reporting and doing some court stories. That was something that I had to do, and I did that for a while. So that was my experience working from a journalism point of view. My dream was to go be a Sky News correspondent doing hard news and politics because it was something I majored in while studying. Unfortunately, it turns out that I don't have the kahunas to do that. So I eventually left the radio world and the journalism world and moved into a marketing position. So I sold my soul to the bad guys, and I worked in a business doing B2B marketing as a marketing manager for a while before taking a position at an influencer marketing company where I worked for a year, and I specifically specialized in putting together influencer marketing campaigns. And I not only did that in South Africa, I did that in the United Kingdom as well. Really exciting for me. I got to work with Barclays Bank at one point. So all of those sort of things have kind of put together where my mind is. From all of that, I decided to talk about video games. So there you go. And that is kind of how my frame of reference in this conversation comes about, is I've worked in a lot of the sides. And I've also been in media before digital kind of took over. And I've obviously definitely been in digital because that is now my job. So that just gives you a little bit of understanding as to who I am and why I'm going to have an opinion on the death of the gaming journalist. I need to make something very clear, and this is a mountain that I will die on. And it's something that I feel very strongly about, and that is that we need to understand that there is a huge distinction between a journalist and a reporter. And I want to make that clear. This is, like I said, the mountain I will die on. A journalist is someone who gathers, processes, investigates, and then disseminates the news and information to serve the public interest for their community. A reporter is someone who delivers the news through a specific medium, but they aren't necessarily the person who conducted the research. So, a reporter can be a writer, a newsreader, a TV person, whatever it is, that is a reporter. Reporters can be journalists. Journalists can be reporters. Not all reporters are journalists. We've got that. From a gaming perspective, because that's what we're talking about here, a gaming journalist is someone who spends time investigating and putting together the claims. I'm going to use a good example here. So imagine there's some claims about a game development company that's forcing their staff to work themselves down to the bone during crunch, and they're not getting any sort of compensation for that. Or a journalist is someone that goes in and investigates the mass retrenchments at a development studio, gets different sources, starts pulling legal information, puts that all together, and then presents that story to you. A reporter is, say, the person who maybe is in South Africa, who sees the story come out online. Maybe they saw a link on Twitter or whatever, and they take that story from whatever medium they got, they rework it, and they publish it to their audience. And they don't really, when I say rework it, they simply take what was found, quote the source, and then report it to their audience, but they're not necessarily doing the investigation into it. That's one example to try and show you the difference between a journalist and a reporter. Got it? Cool. Like I said before, journalists can be reporters, but not all reporters are journalists. So keep this in mind as I go on, because it's going to become very relevant down the line. The next thing that I want to talk about is specifically advertising and how advertising budgets are a little bit different. Now, back in the day, and again, this is something I'm telling you so that you have context, because down the line it'll come into play. So advertising used to be separated into two things. The first was above the line, and then there was below the line, okay? They called it marketing, but whatever. Above the line marketing, below the line. So above the line was things like television, radio, big billboards outside, newspapers, magazines, whereas below the line were things like sampling products to customers, promotions in store, events that you could do, public relations, okay? So above the line, specifically focused on going for mass reach. Below the line is about having a direct relationship with a customer. Also, advertising budgets for a long time were separated into regions. So, depending on how much a region sold of a product would determine how much advertising budget they got. So I'm going to explain this a little bit more, because I completely understand that maybe you're like, what has all of this got to do with the death of the gaming journalist? We'll get into it. What caused the death of the gaming journalist? Is the gaming journalist dead? Will we know? Maybe at the end of this we'll find out. But what caused the death of the gaming journalist? It's actually one word. Surprise, maybe two words. I mean, I don't know if it'll be more dramatic if I go with two words or one word. I'm just going to give you the answer. The internet. Okay, let me explain. You're like, what? The internet? Are you crazy? Let me explain. So before the rise of the internet, think about where you used to get your content, the content about gaming that you loved, okay? There was specific media outlets for each region. So I grew up in South Africa. We had NAG magazine. That was a South African gaming magazine that covered everything gaming and cultural. And we had a TV show called The Verge. We had these very specific South African mediums where gaming could be shared. If you wanted to get gaming news, reviews, stories, you had to interact with these local mediums. And of course, you could get hold of the international stuff. Maybe you went overseas and you could grab them, or you could spend a small fortune on making sure that they got flown in. A lot of regions would fly in overseas publications, but the post offices were still pretty rubbish, so they'd come in 3 months late. You'd have to put them on back order. They cost a lot of money. It was impossible to to watch overseas gaming shows because things like YouTube didn't exist. So advertising budgets were then traditionally separated into below the line and above the line marketing, which we discussed a little bit earlier and that I explained. Advertising budgets were also further separated into regions. So each region, if you were a gaming dev or you were maybe a laptop brand or whatever, you would look at each region and you would say, okay, in South Africa, we sell X amount of games on hard copy, or we sell X amount of monitors, so they get X amount of budget. And then that budget was separated with the local media. So you would see a mix of above the line and below the line. So sometimes you would see a promotional thing in your favorite gaming store. There'd be a discount, maybe there'd be coupons. And then you would also see advertising or a big spread in an advertising, a very clear advertising spread in your favorite local magazine. If you were from South Africa, that would be NAG, or you would see a billboard advertising the game. And then the internet came into effect. When the internet came about, you could start getting your gaming news from anywhere you wanted. If you wanted to go onto a global news site to access gaming news, you could do that. If there was an international gaming site, you could go in and get that information. So you were no longer limited to what was on offer in your region. Now, remember what I told you earlier about the difference between journalists versus reporters? Most of the big international gaming sites that had bases in, say, the UK or the US had these very large contingents of people working for them. They had TV shows and magazines in their media stables, and they were able to take that staff contingent and ultimately get them to move content onto their websites. Those staff were all over the world, and just by virtue of the size of, say, the population in the States or in Europe, they had bigger budgets because there was more advertising to hire more people, and those people had direct access to developers. They had connections, and as a journalist, they were able to break big stories. They are the people that tell you about something that's going to be launched on an iPhone before anyone else. Before Apple tells you what's happening, they can say, oh, we've heard, or here's some leaked footage, or we spoke to this game dev and this and this and this could potentially happen, or we heard that this esports player is going to move, because they were able to foster those relationships. They had those communication networks, and they are journalists. Their job is to go and investigate and find stories, find information. Let's word this correctly. Find information that they can process, put together, package, and disseminate to you. So if it was gaming or esports related, that was what they were doing. However, smaller regions couldn't necessarily break these new stories. They may have journalists in their stable, but they don't have the direct contacts with these game developers or with the esports teams or things like that. So what they ended up having were reporters, and what those reporters would do is the story that the journalist had packaged would break on a big website, and the reporter in a smaller region, whether they worked for a newspaper or a magazine or a gaming website in the smaller region, would take that content, rework it and report on it, but not necessarily add anything to it. Making sense so far? Have I got you? Because of this, we started to see more and more of these big international sites get more and more eyeballs. Because the eyeballs of smaller regions, people in those smaller regions, gaming fans in those smaller regions, started shifting towards those international sites. Now, what happens when they have more eyeballs on their websites? They can charge more for advertising. So they would put banner ads up, it would be above the line. They could charge a lot more money because they could say, well, look how many hits we get. Brands pay money to have their product featured or their game featured there because more people are seeing it. And if more people are seeing it, obviously the intention is that there's more awareness and they'll sell more of said product. There were also a lot more opportunities on these bigger international sites. And because of this, because those opportunities started to exist where they had these large contingents of staff that could go and do things, and because they were getting more and more eyeballs, they started getting more opportunities. So a new game was coming out. They would normally broker a deal where they would say to the game dev, okay, you're going to take out advertising. We're going to have all these banner ads at the back here. But also what we want is we have the biggest audience. We want to release our review first. You let us have access to the game and you let our review come out 2 hours before everyone else's, which game devs started doing. It's also something we saw with tech, and this is very common. Things like a new iPhone or a new Samsung phone, when they used to come out at the big announcement where Samsung and iPhone were standing up saying, this is what we're launching, where reporters in smaller regions are quickly writing their notes to get it up. Those big international sites had had access to that tech for 2 weeks already. So the moment the announcement broke, they could push out their review. They could push out anything that they had. And of course, the more they did this, the more eyeballs they got, and you can start seeing how this snowball effect happens. With the rise of the internet, we also started seeing the shift of gamers from hard copies of games to digital. That's something to keep in mind as we go along. The other thing about the rise of the internet and how it affected games media was that obviously social media became prevalent and popped up. Social media basically allows game developers and brands to become their own mini publishers, as I said. So what that means is that they can release information on their own platforms, which are easily accessible to potential customers. They're less reliant on the media to spread the news. I'm drinking Red Bull, like I mentioned. I mean, they have a YouTube channel and they have a TV channel now and podcasts, and they can push their own content out as much as they want. But so could game devs. So all of a sudden you would have Blizzard, and Blizzard has their own channels and they can push game updates. So before they would be reliant on the media to tell people that a new update was coming. Now they can just push it on their social media channels. You can see it really quickly. If you're scrolling through Twitter, if you follow Xbox, you can see all the Xbox news as it happens. Xbox can drop it. So that made it even more difficult for games media, because the information that they used to rely on to share to their audience and ultimately draw their audience is now just readily available to the audience because it's spread straight away by the devs, by the brands. They also then started another thing that brands started doing is they would live stream gameplay and product launches on their own channel. So they no longer needed to have reporters at these events reporting on what they were seeing. People could go, and the consumer could ultimately go directly to this launch via social media. And it kind of meant that the gaming media, where they used to go for this information, wasn't really needed anymore because they could just go direct. Good gaming media still needed because they would give context, they would give reviews, they'd give expert opinion. But for the most part, consumers just started going direct to the source. Also, if you were watching one of these things or you were following a certain brand's Twitter and something came up within seconds, you could then share it on your own social media. So even if you weren't a gaming journalist or a gaming reporter, you could literally access this information at the same time as them, push it out really quickly in like one line. There was no need to like do any fact checks or anything like that. You could just press a retweet button and be like, or a share button on Facebook and be like, check this out. And I mean, I can now take a break and go into a whole thing about how social media basically led to the decline of people reading long format content and how like it became very much a matter of fit it into as many characters, as little characters as possible in video. But this gets a little bit more confusing. And I do think it does play a role in the conversation we're having and how reading long format content became problematic. And I'll talk about it a little bit later. But for now, I think just summarizing it like that will be enough, I'm hoping. And of course, what I mentioned there with social media and being able to share things, it did lead to the rise of the influencer. And I know a lot of people, when I say the word influencer, have a very negative connotation in their head. There's a very negative connotation that comes with that word. I think for the purposes of this, though, we're not going to go into that. I'm going to speak as openly and factually as I can about this. So you're getting long format breaking news from big international sites who are able, because they have these bigger budgets, to push out more content that delves deeper into issues and stories. They are also able to create video content, podcasts. They have access to very talented journalists who can break original stories, because of course original stories on a site means more people come to that site for that original breaking news. And this becomes really difficult for smaller gaming media who can only really report on what these big sites are saying, because at the end of the day, why would you go to the smaller media when you can go to the big site, right? You can also go directly to the game dev or brand social media to get the access you're looking for. And then when you want an opinion on the game, because your friends now have social media and they're sharing commentary all the time, instead of going to those smaller sites where there were reviews or opinions, you start reaching out to the friends online or to someone who you believe shares your interests or has a personality that you relate to, and you ask for their opinion, which is how the influencer was born. It became far easier for consumers to maybe relate to someone that they saw on YouTube. Maybe they thought the person was funny. Maybe they liked their personality and they felt it was similar to theirs. They would watch them play the game, talk about the game, and decide from there if they wanted to buy the game, rather than going to a review written by someone they don't know, telling them the important stuff that they needed to know about the game, or giving them an opinion and they didn't really know the person, so they weren't sure. And this is where the line starts to blur and where we start getting into the nitty-gritty of the death of the gaming journalist. Remember at the start of this, I spoke about above and below the line advertising. Those lines started to blur because originally influencer marketing and social media marketing fell into below the line, i.e. a direct connection with the consumer. But then, because of the numbers that influencers could pull, and because of the numbers sites like YouTube and Facebook could pull, and the fact that they opened up advertising, they started moving into above the line. And slowly but surely, it made more sense for advertising budgets to pull as much money as they could and push it into social media, to push it into influencers, because they could have mass appeal and a direct connection all at the same time. So remember how I explained above was about mass reach, below was about direct connection. Now you had a way to spend money and get both. So you'd pull money from both. And when that money got pulled from both, things like banner ads were the things that got cut, because it made more sense with something like Facebook, where you could directly target someone who'd shown an interest in your games before and had shown an interest in gaming, and you could hit them hard with an advert. It made more sense to spend that money there. Brands started to see the benefits as well of pushing their local advertising budgets, like I said, into those adverts where they could track direct sales, or getting influencers to play the game on a stream or make YouTube videos. Also, because of the blurring lines with the internet, where audiences started becoming more international, you saw a lot of these smaller gaming sites that were region specific starting to get international audiences. And all of a sudden, it doesn't make sense when you get a regional budget to spend it on someone that's maybe not speaking to people in that region, because ultimately that marketing budget that you spend has to result in local sales. So if you've now got a media site that maybe has 30% South African audience, 70% international audience, it doesn't make sense when you can target, say, for example, a social media influencer who has a Twitter following that's 90% South African. So that was where that sort of started happening, where budgets started moving around. Also, it's far easier to pay someone to play a game on Twitch or YouTube, or market a game on Twitch or YouTube, versus buying banner ads on a website where they could potentially report negative news about your game or whatever else. And I am well aware that there is an ethics conversation that comes into play here. I am well aware that a lot of the stuff I'm saying, you start going, whoa, hold on, that all sounds very dodgy and I'm not sure 100%. But unfortunately, I'm just here to tell you what started happening. And this was the thing, right? Is that smaller gaming media, all they could really do was report the information that they're seeing on places the consumer already had access to. And you started seeing this decline in content. You started seeing gaming media in smaller spaces that maybe didn't have access to the budgets they needed, ultimately started just reporting on stuff they saw. They would write an entire article about how another gaming site overseas did a video, or how a Twitch streamer did this. And it started just becoming content that wasn't necessarily gripping the audience, because a lot of that content they could get elsewhere, including on social media. The consumer as well started directing this, because the consumer was demanding more short format content. They wanted things on Instagram, they wanted things on Twitter, they wanted videos, they wanted podcasts. Those things cost a lot of money to make. And don't get me wrong, hiring someone to report, to write reviews, to type up stuff costs money. But hiring someone to be able to do that in a video format and then edit it down and meet a deadline costs a lot more. Earlier on, I spoke about those bigger international sites that were able to consolidate their magazines and their TV shows and bring all that staff in. And of course, the more that they were doing, the more they were able to get more people on their sites, which means bigger numbers, more advertising budgets. When you have a bigger budget, you can bring even more people in to make content. So the more people you have there making original content, or the more journalists you have looking into things, the more original content you have, the more eyeballs you get, and it becomes this tumbleweed, as you can imagine this. What they also did, some of the bigger sites and the bigger media, which I thought was really clever, is when the rise of influencer marketing happened, you saw two things happen. So some gaming media were like death to the gaming, to the influencer. Other gaming media went, hold on. And this was specifically these big international sites. We can work with that. And they started to turn their journalists and reporters into influencers. So what they did is they gave them their own podcasts. They gave them their own YouTube videos where on their sites where they became personalities in their own right. So there were certain gaming journalists that you engaged with. And if those gaming journalists moved to another media platform, you would follow. So they were with, say, for example, I think Richard Lewis is such a good example. He's writing for this website and he creates video content on this website. Richard Lewis is an esports journalist, for those who might not know, but he would be on a particular website creating content, either doing an opinion piece, doing YouTube videos where he was breaking esports information, and then he would move to another website and the audience moves with him. He's since just started up his own YouTube channel, which is smart of him, so he can consolidate that audience. But ultimately what these bigger international media houses could do with those bigger budgets is, like I said, turn their journalists and reporters into influencers in their own rights and hire influencers. And ultimately, when they did that, more eyeballs, they've now got a situation where they've got their gaming site with their banner ads, they've got influencers, for want of a better term, running YouTube videos where they can put ads. They start offering more and more spaces for gaming developers, products to be placed, advertising to happen. What ends up happening, their numbers increase because they've got all this original content. They pull more budgets. What's now starting to happen, though, is the smaller regions are starting to see a decline in budget. So while these big sites are kind of going up on the upward trajectory, the smaller sites and media platforms are starting to struggle. Magazines are completely irrelevant. Because by the time the magazine comes out in a smaller region, that information's been on the internet. There's nothing new there. I can read the review on the phone, the review on the game. There's literally nothing in that magazine that's relevant to me anymore. It's a month old, so people aren't purchasing magazines anymore. So if you're on a magazine, that's struggling a little bit. And also, if you're on a website, everything's being pushed to social. Influencers are getting access. Influencers are playing the games the day they launch. Your journalists are trying to do everything in their power, and your reporters to review these games. And all you're really offering is banner ads on a website. That's how you get your money. But now this is a website that you're just reporting what everyone else is talking about. On top of all of this, and while all of this is going on, like I mentioned earlier, the internet now makes it possible for us to buy games online, and we no longer have to buy hard copies, which means in certain smaller regions, there's not much of a market for hard copy. So why would you start spending money to sell in that region? Because ultimately you can push all that money to international. They can do their social media advertising because you're not selling enough. Those budgets are directly linked to how much you sell. So the internet's now making it possible to buy games, globally managed online stores, Because there's no hard copies, you're seeing a decline in those budgets. And then there's a decrease in the locally allocated budgets even more, because budget is determined by sales. And you can get your main guy in your head office in Ireland to do all your Facebook advertising for you. You can get 3 or 4 influencers in your region to play the game at launch. And then you've got your global live stream. You see where I'm coming here? And what's starting to happen is more and more gaming media has to find its place in this. And this is where it starts getting really difficult. They have to do something original, but it's becoming harder and harder to do something original because there's less and less budget and money is needed to make things happen. Here's the biggest kicker though. Gaming media houses that actually embodied all these changes that I've mentioned step by step as they happened, whether it be from moving away from long format content, focusing more in on journalism as opposed to just reporting, turning those reporters and journalists and allowing them to become influencers in their own right. Those that did that, they flourished. They got bigger. They brought in more money. But the budget spends that are big and in smaller regions started becoming impossible to justify. So those budgets started decreasing. And unless you're now playing in that global space, targeting a global audience, it just doesn't make sense for you to be making that cash. And because gaming media was so incredibly reliant on game developers and publishers, because for a long time that was the case. In smaller regions, gaming media were reliant on gaming publishers for advertising as opposed to trying to look at diversifying their offering. When those budgets dropped, they now had to jump in and try and compete for technology budgets and consumer budgets, and those budgets were already allocated, and other industries, because this didn't only happen to gaming, journalism and media, this happened everywhere. Everyone was competing for the same slice of the pie, and it became really difficult. Here's the thing. When I started this, I said that the topic of today is the death of the gaming journalist. But I want to be clear. The gaming journalist isn't dead. I would argue that there is 100% still space globally and in smaller regions like South Africa for well-researched, investigated stories that share new information and are disseminated to the public that is interested in them. Most specifically, are relevant to the target audience. I don't believe the gaming journalist is dead, and that's why I said that the topic today was so clickbaity. I'll tell you what's died. The gaming reporter. There's no longer a space for a gaming reporter. We have a retweet button on Twitter. We have a share button on Facebook. We have a share button on YouTube. The gaming reporter is done. Simply reporting the news is irrelevant now because everyone is doing it. 72 million sites are reporting the same story every day. There was this fascinating story in South Africa, and this is not gaming related, but it's such a good example that someone broke about a woman that had like 10 babies. And I watched all these media houses locally just disseminate this information at like a mass pace. Everyone was putting out these stories, reporting on it. And it turned out not a single journalist, the difference between a reporter and journalist, had gone in to investigate it. They just put it out there because it was so important to be like, look, we've also got the news. Journalists who dug into it, and it takes a little bit longer as a journalist, went, hold on, this is actually fake. And that's why I'm saying there is no death to the gaming journalist. They exist. But the gaming reporter is dead. And if a gaming media space is struggling, it's going to come to the situation where they will need to look within and they will need to determine how they alter their offering to make it unique to their audience. And I do think that they can take a lesson from influencers. We can blame influencers for a lot of things, but influencers found niches. They focus, certain influencers only play certain games. Certain influencers only do walkthrough tutorials. Look at how they found niches and jumped into those niches. And I think gaming media, if it wants to survive, the smaller gaming media, they need to look at those niches and find a space where they can play. And so instead of playing catch up by copying, because if you try and emulate what you're seeing on the bigger sites with smaller budgets, you're just playing catch up all the time. Instead of doing that, you need to determine what is relevant to your target audience and how do you differentiate yourself from all the noise in the space. The gaming journalist is not dead. They've just got a bit of a struggle ahead of them. Thanks so much for watching Tech Girl Talks. I hope you enjoyed it. And I know I said it at the start of the video, but I'm going to ask again, if you did enjoy it, make sure you give it a little thumbs up and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. Subscribing helps as well. Of course, if you have any feedback, like I said during the episode, I'm not the expert here. This is just an opinion. Feel free to drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And hopefully you'll be with us for the next episode.